Hello, and welcome to the Asclepion at Epidaurus. We're so happy you decided to join us today. Please keep in mind that this is an amateurly put together tour, so if you have any complaints, please shut the hell up. We hope you enjoy your time here in Epidaurus.
Before we begin our tour, we should have a brief history lesson about why this place is so important. The main purpose of the temple is to honor Asclepius, the god of medicine, healing, rejuvenation, and physicians. Asclepius is the son of the god Apollo and a mortal woman named Coronis. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the birth of Asclepius because his mother Coronis was said to have been having an affair.
I'm so excited. I'm so happy.
Oh my gosh, I'm so ready. How's it going?
Out of anger, Artemis, the twin of Apollo, killed Coronis. Hermes then cut the child out of Coronis' womb, giving him the name Asclepius, which means to cut open in Greek.
His name will be Asclepius.
Growing up, Asclepius was raised by his father Apollo and taught by the centaur Chiron. He was raised to be a healer. His whole life revolved around medicine, which included his personal life. Asclepius married Epidaurus, the goddess of soothing pain. The two had many children together, most noteworthy being Hygeia, the goddess of health, and Panacea, the goddess of medicine. Asclepius began teaching and practicing medicine in the temple. There's a very common myth of him being able to raise people from the dead. This leads to his downfall. When Zeus discovered that Asclepius raised Hippolytus from the dead, he struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt out of anger. When Apollo heard of his son's death, he killed the Cyclops that supposedly made the thunderbolt, resulting in Zeus punishing him. Once Apollo's punishment was up, Zeus not only recognized Asclepius as the god of medicine, but also made him a star in the Ophiuchus constellation, which is the serpent holder. This is the medical symbol that is still used today. Epidaurus was the ideal place for the temple and worshiping place of Asclepius, because not only is this where the healing took place, but Epidaurus is also the rumored birthplace of Asclepius, making it very important to Greek mythology.
Epidaurus is a center for worshippers of Asclepius, and many pilgrims come to Epidaurus for healing and worshiping, especially during the festival of Asclepia. During this festival, Asclepius is honored with a procession, offerings, and a banquet. More pilgrims come to Epidaurus during this time than any other time of the year. It is nearly identical to the festival's Athenian version, Epiduria, except that is 6 months later in the month of Bodhidiermon.
Hello, welcome to Epidaurus. I'm Naimiki, a priestess of Asclepius.
I'm Spiro, and I'm head of the temple Asclepius.
We're here to show you what it's like to be a real priest or priestess of Asclepius. Follow us.
Today we will be explaining the lives of the priest and priestess at the temple, so that when you create a sanctuary of Asclepius' great power in Messenia, you will know how to do it.
As you can see here, Epidaurus is well accustomed to travelers because many pilgrims come through here before they make it to the temple. The temple is a few miles from here, so we'll be explaining everything that goes on while we're walking over there.
As we walk to the temple, we will give you some insight on the history of our group. On your left, you can see our famed theater of Epidaurus. Many of our patients come here to... I'm sorry. Evidently, Kyle is not a music major, and therefore we cannot talk about the theater.
That's a shame. Alright, that's not good. That was most of the tour. That's what all the scrolls are about. Alright, moving on.
Okay.
Yeah.
On your right is Mount Tithyon,
Yes.
the birthplace of Asclepius.
That's where he was born.
Which is why he chose to settle his main temple here at Epidaurus.
Yeah, that happened.
Yeah. Despite the distance, the temple and state work together to control the temple. After all, we are a state cult, and Asclepius is the city's patron saint. As the head priest, I handle the treasury and care for the buildings. However, we don't partake in politics. Our major focus is healing people, and no city-state would stop us from doing that or fear that Asclepius would plague them.
There are things we do in wartime. For example, we'll free lots of slaves, we'll keep political documents in our temple where they'll stay safe, and we take in any refugees of war.
It is Asclepius' belief that one's income does not affect their accessibility to treatment. He cares about the individual, not just the city-state. Alright, this is a good stopping place. We're about halfway to the temple, so if you need to use the woods or wash your face or eat, I would do it.
Guys, there's a snake, there's a snake!
Ah, shit!
Asclepian snakes known for their watchfulness and gentleness, are allowed to slither around the dormitories in the temple at night. They are thought to be able to help heal people and do Asclepius' bidding.
Hi! See? As you can see, we have both dogs and snakes at the temple.
Can I have the dog instead of the snake?
No, you can't because dogs don't heal. Hey, girl. Hi. Hi. All right, you're going to have to keep up. Come on, folks. We're going to try to make it back to the temple in record.
Special rites are undergone by each person seeking Asclepius' help in the temple. One must first go through a purification bath, then they must fast for the rest of the day and give a sacrifice to Asclepius. And of course, one must drink lots of spring water. The priests and the priestesses thought that spring water was essential to keeping patients clean and refreshed. After this, they would undergo a process called incubado in the abaton, in which Asclepius would come down and tell them how they would be healed via their dreams.
To continue our tour, I would like to show you some of the buildings and architecture which we have here at the Asclepion. Here is a map of the current layout of the Asclepion. Though we won't visit all of the buildings, I will show you the most important ones. One of the major buildings you will see is our theater. Sadly, that building deserves a tour all on its own. If you wish to purchase access to that tour, the next available session is next Wednesday. I advise you to speak with our touring director, Dr. Bethany Hickok, if you wish to understand further the details behind this separate tour. Now, to begin our tour, I will first show you the propylaea. This propylaea specifically faces in the northern direction. Built around 330 BC, its architecture resembles very closely that of the more popular propylaea, which serves as an entrance to the Acropolis in Athens. The temple of Asclepios itself is built very near to the temple of Apollo Maleatus. It was very difficult, but the Epidaurians did manage to find a virgin site on which to place this temple. Constructed around 375 BC, the temple is one of the oldest buildings constructed as part of the Asclepios sanctuary. Everything built before 550 BC was either part of the Apollo sanctuary or of other lesser temples. Nothing from the Asclepios cult can be dated to before this time. During the initial expansions for the sanctuary, many cult members wished to deny Apollo a place in the sanctuary.
This is the sanctuary of Apollo, you dumbass. You can't just walk in here like you own the place. Apollo deserves to be worshipped forever.
Okay, but Apollo isn't my god, so why should I care?
Because
Obviously,
he's a
Asclepios
god.
is the only god deserving of a
What
sanctuary
are
on
you
this
talking
land.
about? Without Apollo, Asclepius wouldn't exist.
You're-
Why can't we have both? Because he's a dumbass. You brazen
And
bitch.
thusly, shrines for both Apollo and Asclepios were constructed. But the shrine for Apollo was seemingly much smaller for most of the early construction phase, and even into today. After the temple, a statue was constructed in honor of Asclepios and his cult. It was said to be about 4 to 5 meters high and made of solid gold and ivory. To this day, no known construction plans exist that say exactly if this is true, but many inscriptions and records show that this was most likely the case. The statue is no longer standing. Not long after the construction of the Asclepios temple, a temple was, in fact, built to honor Apollo Maleatus, despite the cult wanting the land to be solely dedicated to Asclepios. Not much made its way into the Apollo sanctuary. It was built on a steep hillside and was supported by a retaining wall. Above it was a stoa. The Apollo temple is much smaller than that of the one for Asclepios, however, about 1/4 of the size to be exact. The Apollo temple was not the only non-Asclepian temple to be constructed. Temples in honor of Artemis, Aphrodite, and Themis were also constructed. These, again, were much smaller than the temple to Asclepios. The sanctuary included several amenities, which aided in the healing process for many of its visitors. There were several domestic buildings for living, a bathhouse, a gymnasium, and an abaton where the sick slept, hoping to be cured. The last building I'm going to mention is the Tholos. It is said to be the most beautiful building in the entire sanctuary. It stands almost 9 meters high and is about 23 meters across. It features a colonnade with a large rosette at each center, surrounded by a circular wall of black and white marble. The doorway was finely decorated and led into the middle of the colonnade, which is said to be the most beautiful of its time period. The most curious thing about the building, however, is its labyrinthine layout, and how, though the slabs are cut with straight sides, it still appears to flow in the arc of a circle. There are plenty more buildings to talk about, but these are the most important ones. The building's use entirely for healing processes, such as the bathhouse, abaton, and gymnasium, would have been quite regularly used by the cult and its patients.
The sanctuary at Epidaurus was the closest thing to a hospital in classical antiquity. Those afflicted with illness or injury would enter the temple for rest in an attempt to be cured through divine methods. They presumed that if proper worship of Asclepius, god of medicine, was carried out, their afflictions would be removed.
Wait. So you're saying that they just sat around and prayed and they thought that would cure them?
Basically, the motivation behind this was that the divine were still considered the masters of the world. If it was their will that you would be cured, then you would be cured. In order to show your loyalty and desire to serve, you had to praise them relentlessly.
But, what if someone died? Especially if they were, devoted to Asclepius, what do you do then?
Good question. You have to remember the time in which this idea of divine mastery was prominent. In fact, it was thought of the only method in which one could cure illness or mend injury.
At the time, scientific methods had not been developed to properly deal with such afflictions. Proper examinations and diagnoses had not been discovered yet. True, there were healers who attempted to heal various minor afflictions. For example, as seen in Homer's Iliad, the sons of Asclepius, Machaon and Podalirius, were present in the Trojan War and even helped to mend King Menelaus' wounds using physical and logical methods. There were amateur military surgeons and professional healers, along with respected figures known as iatroi, or physicians. However, the belief was that it was a god's will to inflict illness or injury, and accordingly, it was a god's will if the person could be brought back from the brink of death. Therefore, these early medical personnel were thought of as the actors of gods and primarily relied on ritualistic and spiritual methods when alleviating afflictions.
Wait. Okay, so I happen to be an expert on Asclepius because I accidentally got healed by him one time. Crazy story in Greece. But I have a quick question. Okay, so, how did we develop the medical methods we have today when it just really seems that they were praying and worshiping were the primary methods of curing wounds and sickness? How does that make sense? It doesn't.
Well, it wasn't an immediate transition.
Early medicine men, such as Hippocrates and Galen, had made steps in the right direction in terms of relying more on scientific and physical methods of mending injury and curing illness. They had done this by performing dissections on corpses in an attempt to understand anatomy better. With this knowledge at their hands, they could more appropriately deal with afflictions. An understanding that certain parts of the body were responsible and essential for certain bodily processes was revolutionary when put in contrast to the idea of the divine being responsible for such things. However, they had also made missteps. Such missteps include bloodletting, which was never shown to have any evidence of actually alleviating affliction and continued on into the 20th century, and humorisms. The system of the humorism, as called by Galen, was a way of separating the fluids of the body into 4 different liquids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
These liquids were attributed to and based on the classical elements of ancient Greece: air, fire, earth, and water. They also had corresponding personality traits.
Okay, wait a second.
Yeah.
That still seems very, very different from the medical practices we have today.
The idea underwent centuries of change following these early innovators. All this knowledge was nearly lost by the time of the Middle Ages, but was preserved by Islamic intellectuals in the Middle East.
New innovations and advancements had come about during the Italian Renaissance. Such advancements include the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. This further showed the focus on the physical aspects of health without relying on the divine. Also, after the Black Death swept across Europe, more precautions were taken in order to stem the spread of illness. The germ theory of disease was developed by Dutchman Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who observed microorganisms under a microscope. It was in this moment that the belief that not the divine were responsible for afflictions, but bacteria and poor hygiene. This gave way to new conceptions of health and illness, and that willpower of a divine being was not at work, but disease and poor health.
Alright, listen, buddy, you're still not explaining yourself properly here. This still contrasts with the medicine practices that we use today. How do you explain the religious undertones and how that would be viewed today?
In modern day society, medical men have to have a thorough understanding of the science and anatomy of the human body. They rely on physical means as opposed to spiritual. Doctors who put worship and religion above scientific means are labeled as quacks.